Good morning, everybody. Today we're wrapping up our series on people in the Bible that struggled and faced trials and how they dealt with them. Today, obviously, as this is the last one, we're going to talk about Jesus and just some of the trials and struggles that he faced in his life and how he can relate to the struggles that we go through. In a lot of ways, and in most ways, Jesus dealt with more trials than we're going to face in our lives. And he can relate and understand what we go through. So we're going to look at a few struggles and things that Jesus went through, and then look at how he dealt with them. Jesus knew poverty and exhaustion. Jesus was traveling consistently, teaching the truth. Many times he didn't have food or a good place to sleep, and I'm sure that wore on him. Exhaustion also from having to try to deal with religious leaders, the disciples arguing, people asking him for things constantly can sometimes be more tiresome or exhaustion than even just not getting enough sleep. But he said in Luke 9:58 too that foxes have holes, birds have nests, but I have nowhere to lay my head. And just Jesus vocalizing that he was tired, and felt like he doesn't have a place to really say that it's his own. And many times we feel that way. We get tired and we're not sure where life is leading us or where God is leading us. And we can feel the same way Jesus did in that instance. The second thing that Jesus felt and struggled with was being betrayed. I think if you look at his life, there was a lot of betrayal. The religious leaders who ultimately should have been on Jesus' side and understood who he was were the ones that attacked him and betrayed him the most. Also, people closest to him betrayed him, and that can happen often in our life. If you look at, again, the life of Jesus, Jesus in his most desperate moment was betrayed by Peter 3 times. He was also ultimately betrayed by one of his own and handed over to be crucified. And he was also betrayed by his family in the Bible. So Jesus really understood betrayal. And it's just, this can be one of the toughest things in our lives to have to deal with when somebody we trust or love betrays that. But how did Jesus respond? Jesus responded by turning to God and looking to him in those situations. Next, Jesus knew grief. Twice in the Bible, both in Luke and John, it talks about how Jesus wept. Jesus wept over a loss of a friend, and then wept over the city. In Isaiah 53:3, it says, he was despised, rejected, and a man of sorrow, and just understood grief. Jesus was not detached by what was going on with other people, but felt their pain and sorrow and had grief and felt grief with them. And again, we deal with grief, but Jesus understands our pain and wants us to turn to him in those situations. Jesus also knew temptation. Obviously, he spent 40 days in the desert being tempted by Satan, which is, if we look at our lives, is a lot worse than any temptation we have. He was able to overcome it because he knew where to turn, and that was to God and to Scripture ultimately. And so often when we feel tempted, we try to fight it within our own strength and power, where Jesus turned to Scripture in those times. Jesus knew suffering, and I think this is a huge one. No one, or a lot of people, don't understand what real suffering is, including myself. Living where we do, there's not a lot of suffering comparatively to the life of Jesus. Again, if you think about what he went through, there's a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and not of his doing too. So that's another thing just to think about. It's not Jesus' fault that he went through suffering, but he went through it anyways for us. It's said in the Bible that my soul is sorrowful even to death. And think about how much suffering Jesus is going through, to the point where he feels like he's going to die. And that's just a tough thing to go through, and something that I know for myself I don't face or feel a lot, where we live and what we go through. But Jesus understands suffering, and we can look to Jesus when we are in those times of suffering, and he understands. And then lastly, and I think it's one that we don't think about, but Jesus knew what it was to feel forsaken by God. I think sometimes in our life, when life can get hard, or we're looking for direction or wisdom and we don't get it, we think God's forsaking us. And, one place in the Bible we see Jesus dealing with the same thing. In Matthew 27:46, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And just in his suffering, and in that moment, while he's hanging on the cross, he feels that God has forsaken him. And I think many of us can feel that way again in our trials, but Jesus understands. And I think that's the theme of this morning's talk, is Jesus understands our suffering, and in our suffering we need to make an effort to turn to Jesus, because Jesus is the one that will understand the most. And so often, I know for myself, in suffering, I try to solve it on my own, or keep it in. And I think that's the opposite of what Jesus would want us to do. He'd want us to turn to him and talk to those that we trust in those times of weakness and suffering. I hope you have a good rest of the week. I'll see you next week.